I've talked to you about some of the worst series finales I've ever had to witness. Well, today, I'm talking to you about one of the strangest. I'm talking about the two-part Family Matters send-off, Lost in Space. As soon as I start this episode up, I'm thrown off because seeing Steve and Laura as an item still just doesn't feel real to me. Somehow I can't force my brain to believe that it happened, but it did. They're a couple, and the episode actually starts off with them planning their wedding. After all these years, Steve and Laura are finally getting married.
They're finally getting married! They're finally getting married! They're finally getting married!
Only took almost a decade of rejections before he finally got a yes, but you gotta respect the guy. He put the work in, and he gave that woman Stockholm Syndrome. To make matters even worse, Urkel mentions their honeymoon activities.
It's a long-standing Urkel tradition to wait 3 months before consummating the marriage.
But Steve...
Okay, you talk me out of it.
No, don't like that.
And no, Family Matters. I don't care if it is your final episode. You do not get to make people think about Urkel doing the Urkel. You know what? I expect that from the Fresh Prince. But you? That's just in poor taste. They're interrupted by Buzz Conrad of the International Space Program, which is the show's apparent stand-in for Buzz Aldrin of NASA. How subtle. Buzz tells Steve he's wanted in space as the first ever student astronaut. And based on everything I've ever seen with this character in it, I'm gonna go ahead and say that that's probably a mistake, and not a mistake that NASA would make. Steve initially turns down his dream job in favor of his dream girl. There's a 6-month training period required, but his wedding is all of 2 months away. But of course Laura supports him and encourages him to make history. Urkel is of course more concerned with whatever accidental hypnosis he has over Laura, but agrees to it, thanking her for believing in him. So Urkel leaves for 6 months to train. During his time away, Eddie completes his own training and finally becomes a cop. This concerns his mother, who you may notice is not being played by the original actress, but instead by last-minute replacement Judy Ann Elder, who took over the role for the last handful of episodes. Which is a decision that's odd in of itself, but I've already made a video about that. I don't want to get too into it, but I will a little bit here. If you knew you didn't have the real Harriet for a full season, why not write her off? Or film her scenes for the rest of the season while you still had her under contract? Or hell, don't even do either one of those things. Just send her off somewhere and say that she's doing something else. Instead, you have this other woman come in and replace her, and they don't even play the part the same way. It's odd watching this actress in the role, not because she's bad, but because it's not the character that we know. It's like these last 9 episodes are gaslighting me into thinking I got the Mandela effect. It just doesn't feel right seeing her there. You know, treating Carl like he's her husband, acting like those children are her kids. It just feels wrong. And I don't mean like morally or anything, just wrong as in incorrect. Now here's another one of those weird Family Matters rumors that seem to have persisted over time that I have to go ahead and debunk. A lot of people have said that Jo Marie Payton, the original Harriet Winslow actress, actually played a part in this two-parter. I am here to tell you, she did not. And like, just in general, hearing that, wouldn't you know that? Doesn't that sound a little bit too odd? Don't you think that it would have been a little bit weird bringing her back and having her be in a different role? They would get the actress back for the final episode, but they didn't have her play the character she was most famous for? They instead went with the new mom and then just put the old mom somewhere in the background as an unrecognizable cameo? That doesn't sound just a little bit off to you? And no joke, I've mentioned this somewhere in passing before, and someone actually argued with me in my DMs that Jo Marie Payton was on the last episode, and he had proof. And the proof he had was scenes that included this background actress, who, noticeably, is not Jo Marie Payton, who originally played Harriet Winslow. And I know this because my eyes work. Is your brain okay? This woman looks nothing like the original actress. Why would she say that she didn't want to be a part of the product for the last 8 episodes of the show, and then on the 9th one go, you know what, I'll tell you what, I'll come back, but I'm not going to play the part that everybody wants me to play. You put me in the background behind somebody's shoulder in scene 16. What sense does that make? Why would anyone do that? And if you didn't take my word for it, which I don't know why you wouldn't, you can take hers because she's debunked it herself numerous times. And yet this rumor still persists. It takes all of 44 minutes to watch the last 2 episodes to be able to tell for yourself. Anyway, so Steve goes to space and hijinks ensues. That is the basis for the grand finale. This big send-off of one of the most popular sitcoms of the 90s is just another Steve Goes To episode. Through an overly goofy sequence of events, Steve's co-pilots wind up getting knocked out, leaving Steve as the only one on board who can possibly fix things. Making for a little bit of a dilemma, as Steve Urkel wasn't really known for fixing things, he was known for destroying them. But he does manage to fix things and things start to come along until the title of the episode strikes and Steve gets lost in space. Steve's future wife and the people that he spent the better part of a decade with sit around watching the news, anxiously awaiting his arrival, hoping he has a safe return. And as far as I'm concerned, I think they're handling it all a little bit too well. He's floating in space with seemingly no way to return, and everyone's just so casual about it. I mean, I guess at this stage it makes sense. For any mere mortal man, this would be a life-ending catastrophe. But for Steve Urkel, this was a Wednesday. The episode ends with Steve returning home for Laura and the two sharing a passionate kiss. And that was the end of Family Matters. You know, considering that they teased a wedding this whole time, you would have thought, and you would have been forgiven for thinking, that the show would end on the wedding. It seemed to be the logical closure point for the series at this point in time. You wanted to play the long game and have Steve end up with Laura. So if that's the story you're trying to tell, it would have made sense to see them off. I think it's a really unfortunate way of ending a great show. What should have been a celebration of this series and a compilation of all things that fans had loved, instead came off as some mundane and boring throwaway episode. This finale is so boring. There's not a lot of laughs to be had here, and there aren't a lot of endearing moments or heartfelt goodbyes. It just doesn't seem like the end. As a matter of fact, not only does this not feel like a series finale, it doesn't even seem like a season finale. It feels like any other Family Matters episode. There's no sense of finality to it. And the fact that it's so painfully unfunny is really just a travesty. Outside of Michelle Thomas's 2 scenes where she did manage to get a chuckle out of me, there was nothing at all entertaining about this. The real heartfelt moments feel lackluster, and feel very overly manufactured. None of the characters really get enough time to shine. As a matter of fact, everyone in these last 2 episodes kind of takes a backseat to Steve, and the circumstances he got himself into. And I don't want to be technical here, I know a lot of time has passed since then. We have the means to a lot better technology than we had at the time, but...
That's not good. That's not good.
Was this really something worth showing off at the time? This obviously wasn't the ideal way to say goodbye to Steve and the Winslows. But then again, the last 2 seasons of the show weren't the ideal way to have them showcased either. So I guess in that sense, this episode is right at home. But the decision to end the show this way is still head-scratching. The last thing Family Matters viewers are left with, after having stuck around with the show for 9 seasons, is, hey, check it out, Steve didn't die in the icy vacuum of space. Isn't that great, everybody? And everybody's just like, sure? We have no idea what lies in the future of any of these characters, other than Eddie's a cop and Steve's not dead. That's the end. I don't know a single soul that considers this a satisfying ending. What somehow got greenlit as the grand finale would be a filler episode, if even that, in almost any other season of the show. I would say this is one of the worst endings to a series, but I don't think it's even memorable enough to be called that. I feel like an upset father, because I'm not mad at the Family Matters series finale. I'm just disappointed.
I feel like all my kids grew up and then they married each other. It's every parent's dream.
Since I've already spoke about the day The Office died, today I thought I could take a look back at its funeral. The big finale, the grand send-off to one of the most beloved American sitcoms that was originally actually a British mockumentary. And while the show was firing on all cylinders when it was in its prime, at its end, it was shooting comedic blanks. I've gone in depth about the final season of the show, and I actually probably will again when I cover the show season to season. But I want to make it clear that this last episode isn't the product of a floundering season. It feels very much removed from the rest of the season that it's in. It almost feels like the episode that came before it was the season finale, while this two-parter serves as the series finale. This episode takes place after the documentary's been finished and serves as a reunion of sorts for the Dunder Mifflin crew, which, premise-wise, I enjoy. It sort of seems like the perfect ending for a show that is in fact presenting itself as an actual documentary, but in execution, it's far from perfect. So I'm going to start off by saying something a little bit controversial to some fans here. I think a big part of the problem with this episode is that it's centered around Dwight.
It's true.
Yep, I know. Just hear me out though. I'm not just gonna leave it there, I got more to say. It was always really odd for me how the show started to romanticize Dwight toward the end of its run. There were always moments along the way that showcased his humanity in spite of, well, himself, but he was never the hero, never the main character that you wanted to root for. Yet, by the time this series finale comes around, he's really all that's left. Jim, the show's main protagonist, had already found his happily ever after, marrying the love of his life and having children with her. Michael Scott, the series lead, had already bowed out and taken his exit 2 seasons before. His seeming replacement Andy Bernard didn't work out the way showrunners had hoped, and with Ed Helms leaving mid-season to film the third Hangover movie, it left the show with no one else to turn to but Dwight. Dwight was one of The Office's greatest characters, a highlight even during the low points of the show, but he just wasn't this guy.
You're not that guy, pal. Trust me. You're not that guy.
This was like watching someone try to fit a square peg in a star hole. And no, that wasn't a euphemism. At the beginning of the episode, we're shown Dwight firing Kevin, and then later the two reunite right before his wedding, with Jim noting how much Dwight missed Kevin, and how firing him weighed on his conscience. But I don't know, that just doesn't really seem like the character that's been established. After all these years, it still feels like Dwight is only just beginning to get comfortable with Jim and Pam. And now you want me to believe that he's best friends with everyone in the office? Excuse me? Furthermore, did Dwight and Kevin really have a friendship to speak of? Where is the evidence of this? I've watched the show for years, and it seems like these two have barely spoke outside of Dwight occasionally throwing an unintentional, or actually sometimes directed, jab in his direction. I don't know, this sentimental moment feels incredibly forced, and a little bit out of left field. I don't know if the two of them are the right characters to have this moment with. I don't think Dwight ever really cared about Kevin, and I don't think Kevin had one feeling or another in particular toward Dwight. While Dwight's turn to the light side always felt off to me, I personally don't feel that it worked, and I will stand by it. I think to some degree it can almost be overlooked. Despite Dwight not really working in this role, you could still take comfort in seeing one of the show's strange stars celebrated as it comes to a close. More Dwight isn't a bad thing. But what really can't be ignored is the light this put the Dwight and Angela relationship in. You see, Dwight and Angela had almost always been romantically linked. Since season 2, they were as thick as thieves, and had the same amount of honor amongst them as well. Dwight and Angela had a completely tumultuous relationship, one that involved constant manipulation, cheating on other people with each other, love contracts, and the most uncomfortable scenes I have ever seen outside of Scott's Tots. They were often awful to each other, and their relationship saw much more bad than it did good. It was mostly played for comedic effect. Their antics were a means to laughter, except on certain instances where it was used to further humanize Dwight. But the same couldn't be said for Angela. As a matter of fact, they seem to try to make a distinction between the two by showing that Dwight was somebody who could be redeemed, but Angela could not. But then later episodes of the show kinda contradict that. They were never supposed to be the couple that fans rooted for. They were a fun, bizarre pairing that worked for laughs when needed. But they weren't this be-all, end-all, end goal. The last episode is building to the show's third most important ship, who are the show's toxic couple comedic relief, getting married. Which is a good thing now, apparently. Even though before, for years, it was shown not to be, now it is. Now this is something to be celebrated. In this final episode, Angela is shown to be sweet and supportive. She's beyond loving, and I would even say nurturing to a degree. Overall, she's just a pleasant person. And all of that feels incredibly out of character for the character that's been established. The last episode of the show really tries to soften Angela's edges to make her more digestible for an audience. But like, you had 9 years to do that. and you chose to do it now in the last 51 minutes of the entire show's runtime, it felt more than a little bit forced. I do feel like this was something the later half of the season was building up to. You know, this sudden evolution in character. But they were building to it. The finale went all in with it. I just don't feel like it works. Too much has been done, and we have so very little time to compensate for all of that. I think this whole development takes away from the character's actual purpose. Angela was never developed to be a likable person, or someone that you could learn to love in spite of themselves. Angela was presented as having next to no redeeming qualities, and being generally awful to just about everyone around her. You're not supposed to sympathize or relate to her. At times, she's the blatant antagonist, much like Dwight. Unlike Dwight, though, the show did incredibly little to humanize her and make her a fully fleshed out human being. She was just constantly insufferable, and that was her trait. It also sucked to see Andy devolve so much as a character. I thought the series went out of their way to redeem him and make you root for him, only to factory reset him back to season 3. He's a joke that you're not sure if you should laugh with or cringe at. The show softens the blow a little bit by showing that he ended up semi-successful and somewhat happy, so I won't get too much into that, because Andy honestly is a completely different subject for a completely different video. So I'm not going to complain too much about that. I think they did the bare minimum here to make him okay. I think what's most interesting about this sitcom send-off, though, is that it doesn't have a whole lot of laughs. The episode isn't all that funny. The jokes are far and few between. And the jokes there aren't actually all that funny. I mean, they're not awful, but they're just chuckle-worthy at best. There are still some memorable moments and conclusions. Erin finally meeting her biological mother is a sweet, touching moment. I like that they got Joan Cusack just for that one scene. Money well spent. I think the way things ended for Kelly and Ryan is incredibly stupid, and therefore perfect for those two characters. Like Dwight and Angela, their rough relationship is a fixture of the show that's played for laughs. And this is the perfect way to cap off this coupling. It's nice to see that the cycle of chaos continues for this dysfunctional duo. Creed's story ended the only way that I think that it could have. And the return of Michael Scott, while properly predictable, is incredibly sentimental. Watching him goof off and bond with Dwight nursed my nostalgia, and I wouldn't trade that for the world. However, I do still have some issues with it. First off, I feel like this is a sad misuse of Steve Carell. He hardly appears in the show's Big Goodbye, and he's probably the one most responsible for its success. I think I enjoyed the seasons without him a little bit more than most people did, but I still have to admit that the show was changed without him. There was a noticeable absence with him gone, and no matter who they tried to utilize, no one could quite fill that void. You would think that he'd have more of a presence in the finale, but he honestly hardly even gets a line. This episode suffers greatly from a lack of Michael Scott. I get that he moved on with his life, but I think ideally he and Holly would have returned during the Q&A section. This wasn't just Jim and Pam's love story, the camera crew also captured theirs. You'd think that Michael would want to spend some time with the people he once thought of as family. Michael's exit from the show made sense given the story that was provided. But given this story, an earlier arrival would have made sense. Instead, he just had very little to do. It's just weird to think about. He's not even in the final scene at the office with the cast saying their goodbyes. So for as glad as I am to see him make any kind of return, I can't help but feel like ultimately he was tragically underutilized. Even with the last episode desperately trying to wrap things up for everybody, it does feel like one or two characters are left with little to do. They're just sort of there for attendance purposes. The happy endings felt like they trampled over themselves at times. It's a little overwhelming when you're watching the end to 7 or 8 plot points all at once when they have no correlation to each other whatsoever. Even Jim, who is, by all intents and purposes, the series lead, feels like a bit player in the finale. It feels like he gets less screen time than usual. Of course, he's secretly putting things together as Dwight's best man, but he's just not all that present. I have a lot of problems with this series finale. But I want to make clear, it's not awful. This isn't horrendously bad. Actually, in some ways, I think it might have been better if it was. But this ending is just so bland and bleh. Suffice it to say, it very much feels like an over-idealized ending for most of the characters. And it feels a little strange for this series. Everyone's so nice and just genuinely happy to be around each other, which has not been the case for the last near decade. I know that this episode takes place further down the line, but it's not that far down the line. It's a year later. It's a year after the last episode. Now, for whatever it's worth, no. I don't think this was a fitting finale for The Office. I don't think it's terrible, but I definitely find it lacking. The humorless nature of this episode is striking, but I will say it's compensated for by the sweet tone of the story. The humorless nature of this episode is striking, but I will say it's compensated for by the sweet tone of the story. This is a tender-hearted goodbye, a celebration of nostalgia before parting ways with it seemingly forever. While the episode doesn't hit my funny bone, I will give it credit for tugging at my heartstrings. There's something sweet about watching the cast sit at their characters' cubicles, seeing them in a more relaxed environment despite it being the same environment the show normally took place in. And actually, come to think of it, very little of this episode took place in. I mean, the show is called The Office. You'll at least have your episode be about The Office. Not that that's a real complaint, I'm just stating. While I've criticized this two-parter a lot, I do think it's a fitting tribute to the series itself. Story-wise, I think there's some plot points and story beats that don't necessarily feel organic. It's filled with unrealistic evolutions of characters, a never-ending well of happy endings, and in my opinion, put focus on and prioritize the wrong characters. With that being said, I don't really know what else they could have done. There's a bunch of characters who need some sort of satisfying note to wrap their arcs up on. The show's main couple's already been married, technically twice, and now have children. The leading man, Prince Charmless, found his princess in a different castle and left the show. So really, where were they gonna go from here? Their hands were kinda tied on this one. I would say that the Office series finale it's passable. It's passable. I would say passable. That's the right word. It's not awful in its own right, but it's not awesome in its own right either. I mean, I wouldn't say it was bad, but I wouldn't say that it was good. It was underwhelming and disappointing given the series that it's attached to. Despite all of that, man oh man, does that one scene with them at the tables really get me in my feels.
Would somebody please tell me why my worst nightmare is coming true?
Have you ever caught the ending to a show without actually knowing that it was the ending to a show? That's a legitimate question, by the way, so feel free to answer in the comment section below. I genuinely want to know because that's not only something I've done before, that's something I've done multiple times before. Like, at least twice. Which seems kind of odd because how do you even do that? Series finales are the grand send-offs of the shows that they're a part of. Usually these episodes revolve around paying tribute and celebrating all that's come before, while also wrapping things up with a nice bow. Sending characters off in different directions, resolving issues, season and even series-long plot points finally coming to a conclusion. A TV show's last episode is usually filled with big gestures, as this is a gift to the fans. A thank you and goodbye. Or at least that's what they're sorta supposed to be. But what happens when a show doesn't make a scene on its way out? Never announcing its exit, but instead silently going off into the night to never be seen again. Today we're gonna find out, because that's exactly what Everybody Loves Raymond did. I don't even know where to begin when describing this finale. I think it may legitimately be the worst that I've ever seen. I know that I kind of title all of these videos, they're all part of the same series. This had the worst finale, that had the worst finale. But genuinely speaking, I think this might be the worst series finale of all time. It's crazy that this never gets brought up in conversation of the worst series finales because I think at the very least it's a very promising contender. I actually think the fact that it doesn't get brought up in conversation is not because it's not bad, but because it's not even worth remembering. I'll break it down for you like this. Good stuff is worth remembering. Bad stuff is worth remembering. But bland stuff gets left by the memory wayside. And that's exactly what we have here. A waste of memory. The show's final episode wasn't anything special. As a matter of fact, it almost feels like they intentionally went in the opposite direction. Now, some of the time, shows have an extended runtime for a final episode. You know, maybe they do a two-parter, or just add 10 minutes to the running time to really emphasize that this is a big event. But they usually do something different. Everybody Loves Raymond did not. You know, which is fine, because not everybody does that. But also, despite what the title may make you think, not everybody loves Raymond either. So if we're not given more in quantity, maybe we're given more in quality. Maybe instead there's gonna be something of consequence that happens in the finale. You know, like something's gotta change. Something big has to happen. Well, you would think, but you would have thought wrong. When looking back at this show, I actually didn't remember how it ended, so I decided to look it up and check. And after reading the synopsis for the final episode, surprise, surprise, it was this episode I'd seen a handful of times growing up, and one that I remember watching. I specifically remember from when I was younger, noting that this felt like a throwaway, watered-down episode. Actually, it was one of the first times in my young life that I identified what I thought was a filler episode. Except it wasn't. It was the show's grand finale. So I decided to rewatch this episode again to see if it still holds down, and what do you know, it absolutely lived down to expectation. I'll just tell you the plot, and then you can tell me, again, in the comment section below, if you think this sounds like the plot for a final episode of a 9-season-long show. So, here we go. Ray gets his tonsils taken out, and that's it. That's it, that's the plot. So, like, does this seem like it matters at all? Conceptually, this plot is a generic trope. And in execution, I can't act like they really did anything special with it either. Make no mistake, I'm not saying this in regards to the cast. They're still as funny as ever, even if this script is not. There are a couple genuinely funny moments throughout, and almost all of them are Robert-centric, so I think that speaks for itself. But between the plot itself and the actual script, everything about this last episode feels so incredibly uninspired. This just isn't compelling. However, they do at least try to do something with it. During the surgery, there are some complications that occur. And for a very brief window of time, the staff find themselves unable to wake Ray back up from the anesthesia, which causes his family to immediately go into a frantic panic. You could easily see how this moment could lead to some tension, even though a lot of people sometimes stall when waking up from anesthesia. I should know, I'm one of them. It's really not a cause for concern, I promise you, everything's fine. As a matter of fact, I kinda think the nurse might have jumped the gun by alerting the family this early on. But this moment is actually pretty intense. We really see the cast come together and actually act as a concerned family would in the same given situation. It's a surprisingly dramatic moment for a show that was decidedly campy. The family carries themselves with such authenticity, probably brought on by years of working together and feeling like a genuine family full of people they have real-life connections with. So for that short period of time, you really feel like you're watching real-life events unfold. For a second there, things look dire. But that's as long as it lasts, just that second, because immediately, that moment is undercut. Like me anytime I have to say something sentimental, as the doctor comes in and announces that everything is A-O-Ray. Seriously, this all happens in the span of a minute or so. Just when it seemed like the episode was going to surprise us, it did. By not surprising us and immediately going back to the status quo. Ryan Johnson, eat your heart out. Now, it's important to note that Ray's mother was in the bathroom during the time of this incident. So as soon as Ray's health is confirmed, the rest of the Barones decide to not let Ray, or his mother Marie for that matter, know about his health scare, because neither one of them will handle it well. Now, let me tell you something, coming from an Italian family, I can confirm with this dynamic, that's a very reasonable thing to do. I understand the decision. You should try to avoid that if you can. These two will just continue to work each other up until both of them are convinced that Ray is dying. It's just not gonna be a good situation. So sort of a godsend that neither of the two knew about it. But of course that plan immediately falls apart when Ray's wife Deborah spends his recovery time lovingly gazing at him and almost breaking down in tears when she remembers that she almost lost her husband. And at the same time, when Ray's father Frank gets uncharacteristically sentimental and alarms his wife, who makes him fess up. Marie then responds by running over to her son's house across the street and hopping in bed with him and his wife. Okay, I know how that sounds, but it is slightly less bad. Frank then has to further fess up to Ray, who predictably also doesn't handle the news very well. Both Ray and Marie act manic, eventually waking up Robert and Amy. Ray questions what everyone did when they thought he was dead, which apparently they all did. Again, it just feels like a little bit of an overreaction here, but alright. I'm okay. Whatever helps me get through this video faster. Upon hearing that everyone was deeply concerned for his well-being, upset at the thought of losing him, Ray is satisfied enough to drop the whole issue, and that's it. He's over it. Problem solved. The last minute and a half of the episode shows the family sitting together at the table. And it's interesting because the final scene of the series feels less like the end of an episode, but rather the beginning of another one. almost as if the show is telling us that the story still goes on. The Barones are going to live the rest of their days as a family and have all kinds of situations. We just won't be joining them on anymore. Which is kind of poetic if that's what they were going for. It's a nice way of letting the story continue without actually continuing the story. There are no definitive ends here, and I kinda love that. But outside of that, there's really not a whole lot to love with this. The last episode is so meaningless and mundane, it's almost like everyone just stopped caring. Like, yeah, we're tired, we've been doing this just short of a decade, let us come in, collect our paycheck, and get home to our loved ones. I'm gonna be very upfront and a little bit mean with this one. But this isn't just a bad series finale. This is a bad episode. This legitimately would feel like a filler episode if placed anywhere else than where it is. Just a meaningless episode that was half-assed out to further fill a season. It is mind-boggling to me that this is this show's final impression. A show that started off and survived on a high note, crashed and burned as it tiptoed to the finish line. How does one person call themselves a fan of the show and then watch this and not feel a little bit let down? I don't know. I really don't know. More people should be talking about this. I'm upset. Everybody might have loved Raymond, but nobody loved this series finale. No one even cared enough to remember it. Recently, I talked about the finale of the show Everybody Loves Raymond, and in that video, I said that it was one of 2 series finales I watched as a kid without ever knowing that it was a show's actual finale. Today, I'm here to talk about the other one. Now, what's important to remember is that way back when, you saw these shows whenever they'd come on. There wasn't any streaming service you could watch them on, there was no box sets of the seasons that were made. Binge watching was really not a thing outside of a marathon. You caught it when it was on, or you didn't catch it at all. Sometimes they'd air episodes in order, and sometimes they wouldn't. Sometimes you'd be watching the channel it was on, and you'd be watching what felt like a compilation of random episodes. Here's this show season 2, here's this show season 6, here's this show season 3. It didn't make sense, and it didn't have to, I guess. Cable companies just did whatever they wanted to do. Hence why I've seen this episode numerous times, but never once had any idea that this was the show's send-off. I'm talking about the Full House series finale, the 2-parter titled Michelle Rides Again. And honestly, a lot of the complaints I had with the Everybody Loves Raymond series finale are the same problems that I have here. It's that this episode doesn't feel like a series finale. This isn't a big event, it just feels like every other episode. I think in a series, the pilot and the finale should feel special. And this, well, this doesn't. This feels like it would blend in with the bunch. And as you know, for me, it did. This episode is so inconsequential and uneventful that you would think it was a throwaway episode from the middle of a season. This 2-parter doesn't give a definitive ending to the series' leads. There aren't any clear send-offs or even goodbyes. Instead, it's a tropey gimmick episode that doesn't close out the story so far, but instead focuses on telling its own. It's an odd choice because you would think that the final episode of a show wouldn't just be some random independent story. It'd be something that's meaningful and applicable to the rest of the show as a whole. Even if you have an episodic series, it's weird to have your final episode be an episodic episode. But hey, you know, at least they made it a 2-parter, so they got that right. What you need to know going into this episode is that Michelle likes horses now. Never did before, but now she's all about horses, loves them. I think they were making that Mary-Kate and Ashley horse riding video game at the time, so you know, they really had to cash in on that. They really had to bring the horse into the brand. She is suddenly a junior horseback rider, and this brand new plot point that has never been discussed prior to this episode will be the curtain call on the show. As she's practicing, she meets another girl, Elizabeth, and the two become friends. Elizabeth invites Michelle to a horseback riding competition, which Michelle's father, Danny, initially says no to, until meeting Elizabeth's snobby mother, who prematurely claims her daughter's victory. This irks Danny to his core so much that he not only allows Michelle to compete, but also pressures her to beat Elizabeth. But that's just a plot. And not just a plot, but the A plot. The B and C plots consist of Stephanie and DJ's lackluster love lives, and how neither of the sisters can get a date. Stephanie can't seem to make things work with her crush even though they're playing Romeo and Juliet in their school play, and DJ just can't seem to find a guy who keeps her interest. They're both looking for love, but they're both coming up short. And despite the two sisters going through the exact same thing, these are two separate stories that don't intersect whatsoever. Wonderful. Twice the problem, none of the reward, and less screen time for everything else. But nothing of note happens with either of those two plots in the first episode. There's another alphabetical letter plot with Jesse, where he's doing too much and just doesn't have time for anything. Which is funny, because that's kind of an issue I have with the show overall. It's doing too much and it doesn't have enough time to tell an actual story. But who cares about all that stuff, because really, it's all about Michelle. She's the star of this episode, and she's the star of the show that we're talking about. And she's one of a kind. Both of her. Elizabeth Olsen's sisters are feeling really insecure about riding, knowing how much is at stake for her father. And Elizabeth, not Olsen, is also feeling disappointed by her mother's actions. So the two girls take their horses and ride off away from the competition, not wanting to give in to their parents' pressure. Unfortunately, Michelle's horse either gets spooked or just doesn't quite land a jump, causing Michelle to get injured. By the time Danny, Joey, and Jesse find her, she's already unconscious. And that's the end of part 1. Part 2 begins with the Tanners making their way over to the hospital to visit Michelle, who is finally awake and alert. But she isn't quite feeling herself just yet, waking up without any recollection of any of her closest family and friends. Or even herself for that matter. It would seem that the fall from the horse caused head trauma and gave Michelle amnesia. She has no memory of anything at all. Throughout the episode, the whole family desperately try to get her to remember, but to no avail. They try everything they can think of, showing her family pictures, recalling old memories, having her tour the house, but unfortunately it has no effect. Now, while the family is in crisis, desperately trying to get the youngest Tanner to remember who they are and who she is, Steph finally shares a kiss with the boy she likes. Jesse's subplot is wrapped up in a sentence in passing with him saying he's going to spend more time with his family. DJ just kind of sits around and talks about not going to the prom until the ending, where Steve makes his triumphant return. And that part's actually pretty good. Actually, DJ and White Aladdin reuniting may just be one of the only qualities this episode has that makes it feel like an actual ending. It's like, yeah, there's that nostalgia we were looking for. Michelle eventually goes to sleep, where Mary-Kate meets Ashley. They have like 30 seconds of screen time together, and then Michelle wakes up with a full memory. Well, I guess not a full memory, as now she has no memory of when she had no memory, which, is quite concerning. I mean, this is worse than I thought. Poor girl's got amnesia. It's the type of amnesia where you don't remember when you originally had amnesia. For all the concussions I've gotten in my lifetime, I've never actually suffered from amnesia. So I probably shouldn't with certainty say this, but I will anyway. I'm almost entirely positive that when you heal from amnesia, you don't just get your old memories back and then forget the new ones you just made. You don't stop forgetting and then start forgetting a different period of time. I'm almost entirely sure that's not how that works. There's not like a PhD or an MD at the end of my name, so don't take my word for it, but, Google is your friend. Then again, I'm talking about the show Full House, which really isn't known for its realism, but instead its sappy, sentimental mentality, so maybe I'm the one at fault here. Look, I know, I'm watching White Family Matters, but I'm not expecting something incredibly compelling. But come on, almost anything would have been better than this. This show did not treat their series finale as if it was their series finale. And that's probably because it wasn't supposed to be. While this episode was always intended on being the Season 8 finale, there were plans for a Season 9. Unfortunately, the show got cancelled before they could get to it, not ever giving the Full House crew the opportunity to craft an ending to their near-decade-long story. How unfortunate. Again, I can't say that I'm a raging Full House fan. It's something I kinda liked when I was younger, but doesn't really do anything for me now. But nonetheless, I think it deserved better than this. It deserved at least an opportunity to say goodbye with dignity, to be celebrated by its audience one last time. It feels really cheap knowing that this is the way it went out. Forced to call a season finale a series finale and just go on about their business. Although to be fair, this episode is pretty goofy for a season finale as well. It's just weird to think that this is the last that we'd see of the franchise for 2 decades. This was it. This was the end. I do think Fuller House definitely provided better closure on all the characters' lives, and its series finale is a much better series finale than this one. Although to be fair, the Fuller House series finale was actually a series finale, so there is that. But never mind any of that, because here's the real newsflash here. Scott Menville, Robin from the Teen Titans and Teen Titans Go, is in this episode. Thank you for showing up in this. That is my silver lining here. Overall, I think Full House had one of the weirdest and wackiest series finales. I'm actually genuinely surprised that the show wasn't allowed to properly close out on its own. For as big as the fan base was and for as many seasons as it was on the air, you would think the studio would have at least given them the opportunity to wrap everything up. I'm not even saying greenlight them for another season, but at least greenlight them for another episode. You know, maybe a TV movie, something, I don't know. This just doesn't sit right with me. For me, I think this has to be seen as a mistake. And one of the biggest blunders to close out a beloved show, Full House was a full-on disappointment. With all that being said, if you like this video and would like to see more great series with terrible finales, let me know in the comment section below by leaving a comment saying,
"Have mercy."
I am vengeance. I am the night, and that was V Infuso. Just remember, if you're not tuning in, then you're missing out.
So, if you like the words that came out of his mouth hole, and you too would like to become a V-generate, don't forget to like and subscribe. Thanks for watching, nerds!
And if you're not joining the fun, you're in for one bad day. And you know what they say about having one bad day?
Catch him next time. Same bad time. Same bad channel.